most industries aren't attacked in the way that the crypto industry was.
Welcome back to the Crypto Playbook. This is episode 6, The Politics of Crypto. I'm Jeff John Roberts, finance and crypto editor for Fortune magazine.
And I'm Leo Schwartz, reporter at Fortune.
This week, we're here to discuss, as the episode suggests, the politics of crypto. And we called it that in part because once upon a time, crypto wanted nothing to do with politics. I can recall my early days covering crypto. It was entirely based out of the West Coast. And like many on the West Coast in Silicon Valley, they looked at Washington, D.C. as a foreign planet they wanted nothing to do with. But things have changed. What do you think, Leo?
Yeah, I feel like a broken record, but Satoshi Nakamoto did create Bitcoin in the wake of the financial crisis, basically as a pillar saying we do not want governments interfering with our money. Obviously, this has shifted in the past 5 years pretty dramatically, where first crypto courted Washington, was expelled by Washington, and then came back with bushels of money and were able to convince the Republican Party and the Trump administration to fully embrace the sector. So obviously there's been a massive sea change in how the industry approaches politics, how politics approaches the industry, and I think really open questions about whether there's hypocrisy there from the original vision of what crypto should be.
Yeah, and I should say, though, there was a brief flicker way back in 2013, 2014, where crypto people, or should I say Bitcoin people, testified before the Senate. So they had their brief moment in the sun. There was something called the Bitcoin Association, I believe it was called, or I can't remember what it was called, the Bitcoin Foundation. And a few of them, and there's some of them were good people, a couple of good lawyers. But then I think the president, I can't remember if he, defrauded the thing or went to jail. It was a very sort of on-brand crypto story where some good people did their best, and then, the thing blew up. And then, there was sort of the outlaw years where it was almost like Hunt Crypto, which went, ebbed and flowed depending how hot the crypto markets were. And then you could argue peaked under former SEC chair Gary Gensler and Elizabeth Warren, who really put the screws to the crypto industry. And it sort of feels like we're living in a very different era all of a sudden. And you were there for that, Leo. What do you recall as the high water mark of the anti-crypto era?
What's interesting is, people forget this now, I think, but during Trump's first administration, he was pretty opposed to crypto. He basically called Bitcoin fake money, as many bankers and older people in finance love to say. That has obviously shifted, and I think that really happened under Biden, where originally there was a bit of a bipartisan push to do lower hanging fruit legislation like around stablecoins or dollar-backed cryptocurrency. But after the collapse of Sam Bankman-Fried's FTX in 2022, who was a very, very omnipresent figure in D.C., there was a huge backlash. And basically you saw a lot of the Democratic Party, many of whom had taken money from SBF, really reject the industry. And under Gensler, who led the SEC, and Senator Warren, there was a real push against it. And in response, you saw people like Kristin Smith, who we'll be talking to today from the Blockchain Association, or one of the biggest trade policy groups, really rally the industry together and say, we need to court Washington or else we're not going to exist as an industry. And they were able to do that by raising tens and hundreds of millions of dollars to elect pro-crypto politicians, including Donald Trump. And that's basically where we are today, where D.C. is overwhelmingly a pro-crypto city, which was incredibly different just a couple years ago.
Yeah, and I think that some of that is due to our guest, Kristin Smith, who I've known for years and years, former Hill staffer. And I really admire her because I don't share all her politics, but she single-handedly built an effective trade body. Once upon a time, it was just her on Capitol Hill, and it was really kind of like literally a voice in the wilderness almost. And through just sort of sheer, perseverance and very good political tactics, pulled together a coalition to make crypto one of the biggest forces in Washington. It's a remarkable story. It's easier, obviously, when you've got, tens or hundreds of millions of dollars flowing towards you. But a big reason that happened in the first place was for people like Kristin, and Kristin especially, to get a lot of crypto people who frankly were illiterate in politics to understand the ways of Washington. When I first talked to Brian Armstrong, the CEO of Coinbase, about this, he's mused on it that they should just get rid of the SEC and create a whole new digital agency. And yes, in a perfect world that's what would happen, but that was sort of the the baseline assumption of a lot of people in crypto. And so I think it's been a real education, and Kristin's a big reason for that. And I suppose without further ado, let's go into the interview with her and find out what she has to say.
Without further ado, let's turn to Kristin. Kristin, thanks so much for joining us today. Great to have you here.
It's wonderful to be here, Leo.
And it's an exciting time to have you here. I know that you've had a busy couple weeks. You're coming a few days after a visit to the White House, right?
Yeah, after much drama and ups and downs as to whether or not the Genius Act would get signed into law, it finally made its way to the president's desk. And I did have the honor of attending the bill signing ceremony in the East Room of the White House, which, as someone who's had a career in Washington for 25 years, it was an absolutely electric experience, and to see something go from start to finish is really amazing. But a huge milestone for the crypto industry, and I think it really paves the way for the integration of stablecoins and other crypto technology into the traditional financial world.
And we're gonna get to what that actually means, unpack that through the episode, and what it means to have stablecoin regulation or even a bill to legislate the crypto industry. And I think the best way to start is really looking at your own career and history in crypto policy. And I think those two words almost seem like an oxymoron. Someone who understands crypto, which was supposed to be this renegade industry coming after the financial crisis of 2008 as a way to disintermediate or basically take out institutions like governments or banks from finance. And now there's this active effort to actually create regulation around it. So I'd love if you could just start off giving a bit of a background on your own history in crypto policy and how you came into the space, which I'm sure has evolved quite a bit since your first foray into it.
Yeah, no, I am currently president of Solana Policy Institute. And prior to that, I was the CEO of Blockchain Association, which is the major trade association in D.C. representing the crypto ecosystem. And I got into this, I think I first started learning about Bitcoin and blockchain 8 years ago, but it was about 7 years ago that the Blockchain Association launched. And at the time, there was less than a dozen people in D.C. thinking about these issues. And this was really a first step for participants in the ecosystem to engage with Washington. Fast forward to today, you have many companies that have large policy teams and, lawyers and communications professionals and lobbyists, and are actively engaged in educating Congress, regulators, the White House, and others about the technology, but also, suggesting solutions and trying to be a, constructive participant. So the industry has come a long way. But I think, it's a critical step, because if this is if these are going to be the rails of finance, like, we need to have the support of governments. We need to have the trust of the users. And so the, sort of libertarian roots, I think, are really important. And a lot of those values we carry with us. But you have to have a dialogue with government if this is something that is going to be utilized on a mass scale.
So 8 years ago, when you started working in this space, did politicians even know what blockchain or Bitcoin was?
No, I mean, quite frankly, a lot of them still don't know today. So I think we've come a long way, but no, there were maybe 4 or 5 who even were familiar with what it was, and it was not something that committees were holding hearings on. There were not bills being introduced that address this. It was a very, very small number of people that had really taken the time to learn what it is. I have to say, it was a lot simpler back then. We didn't have DeFi, we didn't have all of the chains we have today. It was really just sort of Bitcoin and Ethereum, and then a whole bunch of ICOs. So I think the market's gotten a lot more interesting and sophisticated since then.
And I also imagine back then it wasn't only difficult to convince politicians to start caring about it, but also a lot of people in, like you said, this very libertarian crowd, which was created by, the cypherpunks, or this group of people on the internet who probably had a lot of skepticism about the government. So was this difficult to try and push for this idea that there should be regulation for an industry that almost by definition wanted to be unregulated or more on the vanguard?
Yeah, I think there were a lot of people within the crypto industry that were very skeptical, and especially given that this is such a global technology, right? If you could connect to the internet, you could connect to a blockchain. And so there were really different opinions, and that there are people overseas that were able to kind of proceed with models that were very different than companies that were based here in the US could do. And so, listen, I think that, the cypherpunks believe in the right to control your own assets. They believe in a right to privacy. They, have some values that I think, would be good to import into the system that we have today. And so I think a lot of the original intent is there, but there are actors. It's a complex ecosystem. There are a lot of different sectors. There are participants in the technology ecosystem that are intermediaries that do hold customer funds, and we haven't had regulation for them, right? And so I think it's important that we do put some rules over the road in place for the parts of the ecosystem where there are centralized intermediaries and there are risks that can be mitigated with proper regulation.
Even in the last 7 years, there's been so much change where under President Trump's first term, he obviously, and it's a bit forgotten now, but wasn't that friendly toward crypto. Obviously, there was a lot of actions against the crypto industry then. Under Biden, it's interesting because the first half, you had obviously Sam Bankman-Fried, the founder of FTX, the crypto exchange, as this huge force in DC, pouring tens of millions of dollars in DC and really being on the precipice of passing bipartisan legislation, right?
Yeah, I mean, in the leading up to the collapse of FTX, yeah, Sam Bankman-Fried had an outsized presence in Washington. And it was a weird time because we were starting to come out of COVID. Washington is a very relationship-based town, and people see each other in person. A lot of the meetings happen in person. And obviously during COVID, all of that shut down and people were kind of dispersed across the country. And there wasn't that kind of personal communication on a day-to-day basis. But SBF was on the Hill lobbying Congress in person at a time when it wasn't considered polite to ask for an in-person meeting. He was spending more time than a typical lobbyist does on an everyday now. He was spending so much time in Washington trying to get his legislative proposals through that he was the face for a lot of members of Congress of crypto. He was the only one they had met in person. And so when FTX collapsed, it was kind of egg on the face of some of these policymakers that thought like, oh, this nice kid showed up and we listened to him and we took his ideas and ran with them. And I think that the industry realized what a mistake it was to give him such a monopoly on their time. And now on any given day, you'll have CEOs of big companies, of small projects, you have people employed full time. Like there's so many faces that whoever's on the Hill is just one of many in the industry, and every member of Congress has met with multiple people from crypto. So we don't have that problem we had with Sam Bankman-Fried. But, ironically, like the downfall of him was really sort of a forcing function because the industry was in such a low place that not only did we have to get back to sort of where we were, but then we had to, rise up and kind of rewrite the playbook for how to engage in Washington and get things done.
And it was such a low point after FTX collapsed. I think in part because a lot of the Democrats, especially, like you said, had egg on their face, responded more viscerally by really going after crypto. Obviously, under the Biden administration, the different agencies brought a lot of enforcement actions against top crypto companies, including Coinbase. It seems sort of unthinkable that just a few years later, they would be able to pass a bill to regulate the industry. I think cynically, a lot of people look at that and say, well, the reason they were able to do that was because they spent so much money on the elections. I think it's around $250 million in the last cycle, although it's sort of
it's a lot. Yeah. This is not what most industries do, but most industries aren't attacked in the way that the crypto industry was. Boxed in a corner, getting sued. The SEC sued over 100 crypto companies during the last couple of years of the Biden administration. You had the debanking crisis that was sort of all across all the banking regulators. It was very difficult for crypto companies to find somebody that would give them a bank account to make payroll, right? Like this was like an all-out assault. And this political tool was really the only tool that could overcome that. And, what's interesting is most industries don't like to be overtly political. Like they don't want to spend corporate money or even, personal dollars on political giving. It has a bad sort of taint to it. So sometimes industries will go through, a nonprofit organization where they don't have to disclose donors and do sort of this roundabout issue advertising. Crypto is an industry of transparency, right? We want everything on the blockchain where, people can see what's going on. And so the industry took this tact of like, yeah, we're going to write the playbook for how an industry does super PACs, and we're going to put a bunch of money in, and, we're going to use it to get an open-minded Congress elected. And if, somebody's standing in our way, we'll take them out. And that's more or less what happened. And so I think it's really caught the attention, and there have been really bad consequences for those who are sort of stubbornly anti-crypto. So I think if you're a member of Congress today, like there is no upside to being anti-crypto. Like it used to be something Elizabeth Warren touted. As I mentioned before, she had her anti-crypto army political ads. Like nobody's out there hating on crypto. And, there's 55 million Americans that own crypto. They vote. They're active. They call up their members of Congress. Like somebody who's open to regulating this space is, typically like there's benefits to that back home because it's something that their constituents care about. And so, but the political force that crypto became because they were so knocked down is, it happened very, very fast. I didn't see it coming, but it just sort of came together. And I think it's one of the reasons that, we've been successful on the policy front today.
Well, it still seems astounding that in today's partisan landscape, you could actually have a bipartisan bill where the bill that just passed, the Genius Act, which creates regulation for stablecoins, had overwhelming support from both sides of the aisle in the House and the Senate. And again, I think you can cynically look at that and say, how could you have financial regulation pass under today's climate? Really the first bill of that kind since Dodd-Frank, almost 20 years ago. And I think a lot of people would say, well, it's because they're spending so much money to be able to build that type of support. But how would you respond to that?
Yeah, well, I think the money certainly caught people's attention. I mean, there's no denying that. And I don't control the money. I have never controlled the money, but the money is there, and I think that caught people's attention. But you can't buy your way into policy action, right? It's a relationship building tool. And what you have to have is a technology that's valuable, that has potential. What do we need in the US right now at a high level? We need growth, right? We have a horrible situation with our debt and our deficit spending. Like we need growth to help get us out of there. Where does growth come from? It comes from innovation. Where does innovation come from? Probably crypto and AI. Those are like the two big spots. And so I think that you have to be building something good and useful and that has potential. And you have to be asking for reasonable things. So to have a federal regulator for an issuer of a dollar-backed stablecoin that's promising to hold treasuries in replace of that, like that's not a crazy ask. That is a very good and smart policy. And that's what the Genius Act did. And so I think that, yes, did the money capture people's attention and open the door? Absolutely. But it was ultimately, the need for regulation and the need to support technologies and innovation in the US that got this across the finish line.
So we got the big stablecoin win. I don't know when this podcast is coming out, but from recording, it was last week that it was passed. Next up is this, it's called market structure, which I think is a difficult term for most people to understand. Stablecoin was easier. It's these dollar-backed cryptocurrencies, basically, that now will have regulation. But what's the next bill, and how tough do you think that one's going to be to pass?
Yeah, well, there's two pieces that we needed. One is the Genius Act, which regulates stablecoins. And then there's another bill that regulates the other types of tokens that aren't stablecoins. And this is what we refer to as market structure. In the House, they call it the Clarity Act. And there are a couple different things that this bill tries to do. One is it provides a regulator of the crypto spot markets. So if you're just going to buy Bitcoin, there is regulation today from the Bank Secrecy Act and in some states, but you don't necessarily have somebody looking at like the markets and making sure there isn't manipulation and things like that. So creating a spot regulator is one piece. Providing some guidance on what is a commodity or a security is very important because that dictates whether it goes to this new framework or whether it's something that the SEC has jurisdiction over. And then sort of sort of looking at a way for new developers who want to issue some sort of blockchain or application on blockchain that has its own native token, to have some guidance on how to create those new projects and raise money around them when maybe that end product itself is not a security. So very technical stuff and very complex. And I think there's a lot of work that's been done on this. I think that there's a lot of work to go on this. And there's an ambitious timeline that the White House and the Senate has put out saying they want to have this done by the end of September. But it wouldn't surprise me if this is something that kicked into the fourth quarter of this year, or even the first quarter of 2026.
So I feel like the elephant in the room right now with crypto in DC is President Trump, where obviously he's been this huge champion of the industry, unlike any politician really in the past 20 years, where on the campaign trail, he embraced crypto. He said he was gonna do all these things like create the Bitcoin Strategic Reserve Fund and pardon Russ Ulbricht. At the same time, he's been launching all of his own crypto projects, a stable coin, a meme coin. There's been lots of accusations from Democrats about him profiting off of the bills that are being passed. So how do you weigh those two things? Him being very helpful in passing legislation, but also creating a lot of negative press.
I mean, the guy loves crypto, and so does his whole family. Listen, I will take a very enthusiastic Trump family over Gary Gensler at the SEC any day. It is wonderful to have somebody who is interested in all aspects of this technology, who wants to be a part of it. I do think that the work that President Trump does at a policy level is very distinct from the businesses that his children are involved in. And I do think if you look at the Genius Act that was signed into law, that had 18 Democratic votes in the Senate, it had 102 Democratic votes in the House. I think what that says is that this issue and getting the regulation right is much, much, much bigger than Donald Trump. I do think it's an issue that's going to continue to have scrutiny. I think, if you look at Maxine Waters, who's the ranking member on the House Financial Services Committee, this is all she talks about whenever anything crypto comes up. And so, it is a bit of a distraction. That being said, it hasn't gotten in the way of getting good policy in place. And so, again, I'll take an enthusiastic Trump over having to deal with what we did the prior 4 years any day.
It almost has, though, right? With the stablecoin debate in the Senate. I forget what exactly he announced, but like the day that they're going to do a bill, there was some
early in the Senate, the first vote failed, the first sort of cloture vote. In the Senate, you have to get 60 votes. There's only 53 Republicans, so you need to have at least 7 Democrats join the Republicans. And the very first time they tried to move the stablecoin legislation through the Senate, the vote failed because the Democrats were concerned over Trump. Similarly, there were a lot of amendments filed on the House legislation, more on the market structure than on Genius Act. So, I think it's something that is an ongoing conversation. But, with the stablecoin bill, with the Genius Act, I think that got to a good place, and ultimately the policy trumped the politics, for lack of a better word, no pun intended. That lawmakers decided it was the right thing to do, is like, let's regulate this space appropriately and then go from there.
Yeah. Then Gary Gensler, I feel like his name's going to come up a lot, this boogeyman for the crypto industry, the past SEC chair. My dream, maybe if we do another season of this, we can have him on. I think he's off at MIT right now teaching a class, but yeah, I'm sure every time Trump tweets something about crypto, you're either very celebratory or like, oh my God, what's he saying now?
Yeah, no, usually it's pretty interesting. I mean, I think, again, it's the president of the United States cares about this technology innovation that I stumbled across 7 years ago. And I'm like, it's like mind blowing. But he does it because a lot of people approached him, and, this is a crusade that Gary Gensler and Elizabeth Warren had against an industry. And, he gets politics. He understands that, what makes people mad and what government's doing wrong. And I think he has really good instincts there, and then has surrounded himself with good people to help him with the details. And so, I don't think Gary Gensler is gonna and the crypto industry is not gonna let him end up in any place of power ever again. It's over our dead bodies.
Do you have any favorite memories from your adventures in crypto? I feel like I've definitely been to some incredibly strange crypto parties. I feel like the confluence of DC and crypto must have had some interesting moments.
Yeah, well, I think we've talked about it before. It's like if you took the Veep TV show on HBO and mashed it up with Silicon Valley, that's sort of what we have going on. But no, I will just tell one. It's not a story, but just to compare and kind of drive home what we were dealing with before versus now is, it was a year ago that there was a lot of pressure before Biden stepped aside and Kamala became the candidate. There was a huge effort to try to get to the White House. And for years, we emailed, we would send phone calls, we would have lobbyists contact the White House. Nobody in crypto could even be answered. No one would return an email. But finally, a representative from California, Rokana, was able to convince someone from the White House to meet with a group of crypto people. And so 30 people came to town. It was like Mark Cuban and Mike Novogratz and Anthony Scaramucci and all the kind of who's who that, had some Democratic credentials flew in. But the White House would not let us meet at the old executive office building. They made us meet across the street at the Willard Hotel because they didn't want to have this group of people on the visitor logs at the White House. And so I think to go from that situation where we had to beg for an off-campus meeting to having the red carpet, and it is like a red carpet, by the way, that's rolled out at the White House with, musicians playing as you enter to come into this room, to have, Donald Trump talk about being the crypto capital of the world and signing an actual bill into law to a year ago to today is an absolutely remarkable level of progress. And I do think would make a good season for a television show.
It's a level of speed I feel like you don't often see in DC.
It's the speed of tech for sure.
Still waiting for that social media regulation,
Yes.
I think, 15 years later.
Yes.
One last question. I always love asking this question, and especially now that Polymarket and Kalshi are so in the news, but what's the percentage chance you think that there's going to be another bill within the next, let's say, year?
Within the next year, I would say maybe 60%. I think it is very difficult. But, if the president wants something and a bipartisan Congress wants something and industry wants something, I think there's a way to get it done. So yeah, I'm a little bit more bearish, I think, than some. But the good news is I think there's a lot that agencies can do in the absence of legislation. So 60%.
60%, not financial advice for anybody on Polymarket. But thank you so much for joining us today. It was great chatting with you.
Awesome. Thanks, Leo.
Well, I know Kristin Smith has stepped down from the Blockchain Association, but she's clearly still has her media game. What struck you most about your talk with her, Leo?
Yeah, I think there's an interesting tension happening in DC right now where crypto is probably the biggest bipartisan policy issue, where you actually have Democrats and Republicans agreeing that they want to pass legislation around a pretty meaty financial topic. And I think the question is, do you believe all the lofty rhetoric they say about changing what the future of money and payments looks like? Or are they just enticed by the $200 million being offered up by the crypto industry? And I think she had a pretty good take on that, which is it's a combination of both. And obviously the money helps, but it's also interesting to hear from her that this is someone who's been working in this space for years. I mean, she started at Blockchain Association in 2018, well before crypto had made any inroads in DC. So I think it's a pretty fascinating history of how we got to today, where the president is touting crypto at the White House.
Yeah, I'm going to be curious to see the next chapter as well, because, it is a bit of like a feel-good story if you're in the crypto community who'd been sort of shunned and literally persecuted for years to come in and really be, kind of in the mainstream of finance and, in the beating heart of the American political system, What I'm watching now, though, is how much longer that kind of veneer of like feel good idealism can stay on it. Because I've said a few times at this point, crypto, they won, which is great for the industry, but at the same time, I think the underdog and kind of like scrappy outsider feeling that's united crypto for so long, they can't really walk around holding that. In my opinion, we now have big crypto at the table right next to big oil and big pharma and big cable, and they're playing the DC game. They're playing it well. So it's going to be interesting to see, as they become more consolidated, how the political narrative shifts again.
And also their biggest battles ahead. I mean, I think a lot of the industry is marketing in this veneer of victories. They did get the stablecoin bill, which we chatted about in the interview, but the biggest missing piece is this really critical market structure legislation, which is more complex and will basically allow exchanges like Coinbase to operate with clear legal framework, which they don't have right now. And I think everyone understands this is an existential necessity for them moving forward.
That's a very good point, Leo. Currently, crypto still has some very big hills to climb until the rules are in place, but it'll be fascinating to see what happens next. However, that's a wrap for today. A quick programming note to our listeners. I want to thank you all for being part of season 1 of the Crypto Playbook, which has now come to an end. It's been a lot of fun. We've had some of the very biggest names in the industry, some of the key early founders. And please stick around for season 2, where we're going to have even more big names. I'm Jeff John Roberts.
And I'm Leo Schwartz. See you next season.
This was the Crypto Playbook, a podcast by Fortune Magazine.
This episode was produced by Jaylon Ursoy and edited by Ellen Estev. Fortune's art director is Ariel Ray. Executive producer is Lydia Randall. Fortune's head of video is Adam Bannicky.
Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.